The year was 1881. A young girl stood in front of a cheering crowd, a rifle almost as tall as she was. The men around her laughed, not cruelly, but with disbelief. How could someone so small, so quiet, possibly defeat a professional marksman? Her name was Annie Oakley, and in the next few seconds she was about to make history. The judge raised his hand. 25 clay targets flew into the air, one after another. The man beside her, tall and confident, lifted his gun and fired. Each shot cracked through the air. Bang, bang, bang. The crowd counted his hits. 24 perfect shots. He missed only one. Then it was Annie's turn. She took a deep breath. The world seemed to go silent. She raised her rifle, eyes calm and steady. One by one, the targets shattered. Every single one. The last piece of clay burst in the air like a small orange star. The crowd erupted. A teenage farm girl had just defeated one of the best shooters in America. That day, a legend was born. But Annie's story didn't start with fame. It began with poverty, loss, and a fight to survive. Annie was born Phoebe Ann Mosey in 1860 in a small cabin in Darke County, Ohio. Life was not kind to her family. They were poor but hard-working, simple people who believed in faith and honesty. When Annie was just 6 years old, her father died during a harsh winter. The snow was deep, the food was gone, and her mother struggled to feed 7 children. For most little girls, that would have been the end of childhood. For Annie, it was the beginning of strength. She learned to hunt. Not for sport, but for survival. With her father's old gun, far too heavy for her small hands, Annie walked through the woods near her home. The wind bit at her face. The snow crunched under her boots. Every step was quiet, every breath held. When she spotted a rabbit, she didn't think about glory or pride. She thought about her family, about her mother waiting by the fire, her brothers with hungry eyes. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang through the trees, clean and sharp. That rabbit meant dinner. That shot meant survival. Soon Annie was selling the game she hunted to local grocers and restaurants. She was so accurate that her reputation spread through nearby towns. People called her the little girl who never misses. But Annie didn't see herself as special. She was shy, quiet, and humble. She simply did what she had to do. Her aim came from patience. Her calm came from necessity. And together, those two things built the foundation of a legend. By her teenage years, Annie's shooting skill had caught the attention of local hunters and traveling marksmen. One day, a famous professional shooter named Frankie Butler came to Cincinnati for a competition. He was charming, confident, and proud of his aim. Someone mentioned a girl nearby who could shoot better than anyone else. Frank laughed. A girl outshoot him? Impossible. But he agreed to a friendly match, just for fun. He arrived expecting an old country woman. Instead, a small teenage girl in a plain dress stepped forward, holding a long rifle. He smiled politely. The crowd chuckled. Then the contest began. Frank fired first, 25 targets, one after another. He hit 24. The audience cheered. Then Annie stepped up. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes were clear and focused. The targets flew. She fired. Every one of them shattered, 25 out of 25. Perfect. The crowd went wild. Frank Butler was stunned and impressed. He lost the match, but that day he gained something far more valuable. Within a year, he and Annie were married. Together, they traveled across America, performing in small shooting exhibitions. Annie, now going by the stage name Annie Oakley, became a sensation wherever she went. Her husband proudly stepped aside, letting her take the spotlight. People came to see her not just for her aim, but for her spirit. She was gentle, polite, and kind, yet she could outshoot any man alive. Before long, her name reached the ears of the most famous showman of the age, Buffalo Bill Cody. He invited Annie and Frank to join his Wild West show, a traveling spectacle that combined skill, drama, and American pride. It was there that Annie Oakley transformed from a farm girl into a legend, a global symbol of courage, precision, and grace. But that's just where her story begins. In the years to come, she would travel across oceans, perform for queens and kings, and even earn the respect of Native American leaders. She would face injury, injustice, and rumor, but never once lose her aim. From the woods of Ohio to the grand arenas of London, Annie Oakley carried the same rifle, the same heart, and the same belief that no one man or woman should ever be afraid to take their shot. Every shot she fired wasn't just for sport. the narrator says softly. It was a reminder that greatness can come from the humblest beginnings. The story of Annie Oakley begins long before fame, applause, or bright lights. It begins in a small, weather-beaten log cabin in the cold countryside of Ohio. Annie was born Phoebe Ann Mosey on August 13, 1860, the fifth child of a struggling farming family. Her parents, Jacob and Susan Mosey, were hard-working but poor. Life in those days was harsh. The winters were long, the land was rough, and money was always short. When Annie was just 6 years old, tragedy struck. Her father became ill after being caught in a blizzard while tending their livestock. He developed pneumonia and never recovered. His death left the family broken and desperate. Her mother tried everything she could to keep her children fed, sewing, mending, and working odd jobs. But times were cruel, and the weight of survival soon fell upon the small shoulders of little Annie. Food was scarce. Each night, her brothers and sisters went to bed hungry. That's when Annie made a choice that would change her life forever. She would hunt. The old rifle her father left behind was nearly as tall as she was. At first it felt too heavy, too awkward, too loud. But Annie was determined. She practiced every day, teaching herself how to aim, how to breathe, how to move silently through the woods. When she missed, she learned. When she succeeded, her family ate. Annie quickly discovered she had a gift. Her aim was uncanny. She could hit a squirrel through the head instead of the body, keeping the meat clean and unspoiled. She hunted rabbits, birds, and other small game, selling them to local restaurants and hotels. People began to notice. Who was this small, polite girl who never missed a shot? By the age of 10, Annie was not only feeding her family but also helping her mother pay off debts. She became known around the nearby towns as the Little Shooter. It wasn't about pride or fame, it was survival. Still, the world was not kind to young girls alone in the 19th century. When Annie's mother couldn't afford to care for all her children, she sent Annie to live with a nearby family who promised to help. But instead of kindness, Annie found cruelty. The family treated her like a servant. She cooked, cleaned, and worked long hours without rest. They called her names and punished her for the smallest mistakes. Years later, Annie would refer to them only as the wolves. She rarely spoke of that time, but it left deep scars that shaped her quiet strength. When she finally escaped and returned home, she was older, stronger, and wiser. She had endured the worst people could offer and refused to let it break her. Back home, she returned to the woods with her rifle. Each shot she fired reminded her of freedom. Each successful hunt reminded her that she could survive anything. Her accuracy soon brought her small fame in her community. Local shopkeepers and hotel owners eagerly bought her game. Some said she shot like a ghost, silent, invisible, always hitting her mark. By the time she was 15, Annie was earning enough money to pay off her mother's mortgage. Imagine that, a teenage girl saving her family with nothing but a steady hand and a rifle. Then came the day that changed everything. A traveling marksman named Frank E. Butler arrived in Cincinnati, Ohio, for a shooting competition. He was a tall, confident professional who often challenged locals for sport. Someone told him there was a young girl in the area who could outshoot anyone. Butler laughed at the idea. How could a young girl possibly defeat a trained marksman like him? Still, he agreed to the match. A small crowd gathered to see the contest, mostly men who expected a good laugh. When Annie stepped forward, dressed plainly, holding her father's rifle, the laughter stopped. She was calm. Her eyes were steady. The rules were simple: 25 clay targets. Whoever hit the most would win. Butler went first, hitting 24 out of 25. An impressive score. The crowd cheered. Then Annie took her place. She didn't brag or boast. She simply nodded, raised her rifle, and fired. Each target shattered in midair. One by one, she hit every single shot. 25 out of 25. Perfect. The audience exploded with cheers. Frank Butler was stunned. He had been beaten, and by a quiet teenage girl. But rather than feeling humiliated, Butler was fascinated. He approached Annie afterward, congratulated her warmly, and asked to see her again. That competition was not just the beginning of her fame. It was the beginning of a love story. Frank and Annie became close friends. He admired her talent and respected her modesty. Unlike many men of that era, he wasn't threatened by her skill. He was inspired by it. Within a year, they were married. He became her partner both on stage and in life. Soon after, Annie adopted her new name, Annie Oakley, inspired by the small town near her Ohio home. Together, she and Frank began performing at shooting exhibitions across America. Everywhere they went, people were amazed. They had never seen a woman shoot with such calmness, precision, and confidence. But Annie's journey had only just begun. The girl who once hunted to feed her family was about to become one of the most famous women in the world. The next chapter of her story would take her to the grandest stage of all, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where she would become a legend known as Little Sure Shot. The small-town girl who once hunted rabbits to feed her family was now becoming a name whispered in amazement across Ohio. Annie Oakley's reputation as the young woman who never missed a shot spread quickly. Her calmness, her precision, and her quiet strength made her unforgettable. But what truly turned Annie from a skilled hunter into a national legend was one event, the match that changed her life forever. It all began in the spring of 1881 in the bustling city of Cincinnati, Ohio. A famous professional marksman named Frank E. Butler arrived in town to perform an exhibition shooting challenge. He was known across the Midwest for his accuracy, charm, and showmanship. At every stop, he would invite local challengers to compete against him, and, until that day, he had never lost. When he arrived in Cincinnati, a hotel owner jokingly told him, "There's a local girl who could give you a real challenge, Mr. Butler." Frank laughed. "A girl? Outshoot me? I'd pay to see that," the owner smiled. "Careful what you wish for." "Her name's Annie." The match was arranged for the next morning. Word spread fast. Farmers, townsfolk, and local hunters came to see it. They expected a good laugh, maybe a bit of entertainment, and of course, another easy victory for the confident Mr. Butler. Then Annie arrived. She was just 15 years old. Dressed simply, with calm gray-blue eyes and a quiet expression. She didn't talk much. She didn't need to. She carried her father's old rifle, the same one she had used to feed her family for years. When she stepped up to the shooting line, the laughter faded. The rules were clear. 25 clay pigeons would be thrown into the air. Each shooter had to hit as many as possible. The highest score would win. Frank went first. His reputation was well earned. His shots were quick, confident, and accurate. He hit 24 out of 25. The crowd applauded loudly. Then Annie took her place. She adjusted her stance, took a deep breath, and lifted her rifle. The crowd went silent. The first target flew. Bang! A clean hit, then another. Bang! Another hit. One by one, she shattered every target in the air. 25 out of 25, a perfect score. The crowd roared in disbelief. Frank Butler blinked in surprise, then smiled. He couldn't help but admire her skill. He stepped forward, tipped his hat, and shook her hand. "Miss, you've just beaten the best shot in America." Annie blushed softly but said little. She wasn't one for bragging. For her, it was just another day, another target, another steady shot. But for Frank Butler, it was the beginning of something else. Admiration, respect, and love. Over the next few months, Frank and Annie began to spend more time together. He often invited her to his shooting events, asking her to perform alongside him. The crowds adored her. Her quiet, polite manners and flawless shooting made her an instant favorite. Before long, they were inseparable, partners in life and in show. In 1882, they married, and Annie officially began performing under her now famous name, Annie Oakley. Frank, rather than trying to outshine her, stepped aside. He recognized that Annie's talent was rare, something the world had never seen before. He proudly supported her career, becoming her manager and assistant during performances. Together, they toured small towns, fairs, and theaters across America. Each show brought larger crowds. People were fascinated by the idea of a woman who could shoot better than any man. Annie's performances were never flashy or arrogant. She was precise, graceful, and always humble. She could shoot coins tossed in the air, knock the ashes off a cigar from her husband's mouth, and even split playing cards edgewise. Every act was done with quiet confidence and a faint smile, but fame was calling from an even bigger stage, a stage that would make Annie Oakley a household name around the world. In 1885, the legendary Buffalo Bill Cody was looking for new talent for his traveling show, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. It was more than just entertainment. It was a living story of the American frontier and cowboys, Native Americans, soldiers, trick riders, and sharpshooters. When Buffalo Bill heard about the young woman who could outshoot the best men in the business, he sent word, "Bring me the girl they call Annie Oakley." Annie and Frank joined the show that same year. It was a moment that changed everything. The farm girl who once hunted rabbits in the snow was now performing in front of thousands, standing shoulder to shoulder with legends of the American West. Audiences loved her. They cheered as she performed impossible shots, lighting matches with bullets, splitting cards, and shooting dimes out of the air. Her fame spread so quickly that even the newspapers called her the Wonder Woman of the frontier. Unlike many performers, Annie remained humble. She wore modest dresses, smiled shyly, and always thanked her audience. She didn't see herself as a celebrity, only as a woman doing what she loved. Her kindness and skill earned her deep respect. Even the great Lakota Sioux leader Sitting Bull, who joined Buffalo Bill's show for a time, admired her courage and talent. He gave her a Sioux name, Watanya Cecilia, meaning Little Sure Shot. It was a name that would follow her forever. The little girl who once hunted to survive was now America's first female superstar. Her story was no longer just about shooting targets. It was about breaking boundaries, proving that courage, focus, and heart could make anyone a legend. When Annie Oakley joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885, she had no idea she was stepping onto a stage that would make her one of the most famous women on earth. She was just 25 years old, small, polite, and quiet. Yet her confidence with a rifle made her shine brighter than anyone else under the big tent. The show itself was like nothing the world had ever seen. It was a living picture of the American frontier, with cowboys riding wild horses, Native American warriors performing traditional dances, stagecoach chases, gunfights, and sharpshooting exhibitions. At the center of it all stood Annie Oakley, the woman who could outshoot every man in the lineup. At first, the show's organizers weren't sure how audiences would react to a female shooter. Most people at the time believed that guns and women simply didn't mix. But when Annie stepped onto the stage, dressed neatly in her buckskin skirt, fringed jacket, and white hat, something magical happened. She didn't need to shout or boast. She just smiled softly, lifted her rifle, and fired. Every bullet hit its mark. The crowd went silent, then erupted in cheers. From that moment on, Annie Oakley became the star of the show. Her accuracy was astonishing. She could shoot a playing card edge on from 30 paces and then hit it again before it hit the ground. She could snuff out candles with bullets. She could shoot the ashes off a cigar held in Frank Butler's mouth, and Frank trusted her completely. One of her favorite tricks was to split a bullet on the edge of an axe, hitting 2 targets at once. The crowd would gasp every single time, but beyond her skill, people loved Annie for her kindness and humility. She was never arrogant or proud. She spoke gently, smiled often, and always treated others, performers, workers, even reporters, with respect. Unlike many performers who played the tough Western role, Annie represented something different, grace with power. As Buffalo Bill's show grew in popularity, it began touring the world. In 1887, the show crossed the Atlantic to perform in London for the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria, a massive celebration of the Queen's 50 years on the throne. For Annie, it was her first trip outside America. She was nervous but excited. She wasn't used to royalty or fine cities. She was a country girl from Ohio. But when she performed in London, she captured the hearts of everyone there. When her act ended, the crowd roared with applause. And soon Annie received an invitation to perform before Queen Victoria herself. The Queen, elderly and dignified, watched with fascination as the young American woman calmly shot target after target with perfect precision. Afterward, Queen Victoria stood and smiled. "You are a very clever little girl," she said. Annie curtsied, blushing deeply, and replied softly, "Thank you, Your Majesty." That moment made headlines around the world. The newspapers called her the Princess of the Prairie. From that day forward, Annie Oakley wasn't just an American celebrity, she was a global icon. After London, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured France, Italy, and Germany. Everywhere they went, Annie's name drew massive crowds. In Berlin, the young Kaiser Wilhelm II personally asked to see her shoot. As part of the act, she was asked to shoot the ashes off his cigarette. Annie hesitated. She knew the risk. But the Kaiser insisted. She aimed carefully, fired once, and hit the target perfectly. The audience gasped, then burst into wild applause. Years later, when World War I began, Annie would jokingly say, "If I had missed that shot, I might have changed the course of history." Through every performance, Annie remained humble. She often said she didn't perform to impress, but to inspire. She wanted people, especially women, to know they could be strong, skilled, and independent. While traveling through Europe, Annie's reputation earned her many admirers, but one friendship stood out among them all. The great Lakota Sioux leader Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's show during that time. He had heard about Annie's courage and skill and was eager to meet her. When they finally met, he looked at her quietly for a long moment, then nodded and said, "The Great Spirit has given you a gift." He later adopted her as his daughter, giving her a Sioux name, Watanya Cecilia, Little Sure Shot. It was a name that meant courage, precision, and respect, and it stayed with her for the rest of her life. Annie and Sitting Bull became close friends. He admired her honesty, her sense of justice, and her gentle nature. She admired his dignity and strength. Together they represented two sides of America, the pioneer and the native, joined by mutual respect instead of conflict. As the years passed, Annie's fame continued to grow. She became one of the highest-paid performers in the world, but money never changed her. She often donated her earnings to charities, orphans, and widows. She even funded shooting lessons for women, teaching them how to handle firearms safely and confidently. Annie believed that women should not be afraid of power, that they could protect themselves and others when necessary. In a time when women had few rights and little freedom, that belief was revolutionary. By the late 1880s, Annie Oakley was not just a performer, she was a symbol. To many, she represented the very spirit of America, brave, independent, and fair. People saw in her a reminder that greatness could come from anywhere, even a small girl from the Ohio woods. But behind the applause and flashing lights, Annie's journey was far from over. Fame would bring challenges, jealousy, and danger. Soon she would face her toughest battles, not in the arena, but in the real world. By the end of the 1880s, Annie Oakley was more than a performer. She was a symbol of American pride. Everywhere she went, crowds filled arenas just to see her aim, shoot, and smile. She was called Little Sure Shot, the pride of the West, and the greatest lady marksman in the world. But with fame came jealousy, rumors, and a new kind of battle. One she could not fight with a gun. Annie and her husband, Frank Butler, continued touring with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for nearly 17 years. Together, they traveled across America and Europe, performing for millions. Audiences adored her. They admired her grace, her accuracy, and her kind personality. Unlike many stars of the time, Annie stayed humble. She never acted like she was better than others. She made time for fans, thanked her helpers, and treated everyone with respect, from stagehands to royalty. People said she was as gentle off stage as she was powerful on stage. She never drank, never gambled, and never used harsh words. To her, discipline was everything, both in life and in aim. But even for someone as beloved as Annie, fame had a dark side. In 1901, tragedy struck during one of the Wild West show tours. Annie and the other performers were on a train headed to a show in North Carolina when a terrible train crash occurred. The cars derailed and tumbled violently. Annie was badly injured. Her spine and neck were hurt, and for a while she could barely walk. Doctors told her she might never perform again. For Annie, who had spent her life behind the rifle, that news was crushing. But giving up was not in her nature. With the same courage that carried her through poverty as a child, Annie began to recover. Slowly, she rebuilt her strength. Within a year, she was back on stage, her aim as sharp as ever. The crowds went wild. The legend of Annie Oakley grew even stronger. After leaving Buffalo Bill's show, Annie began to tour on her own. She performed smaller, more personal shows and continued teaching women how to shoot. She believed deeply in self-reliance and female empowerment, long before those words were ever popular. She once said, "I would like to see every woman know how to handle firearms as naturally as they know how to handle a baby." Her message was simple but powerful. Women could be gentle and strong, feminine and fearless all at the same time. But just as her life seemed peaceful again, another storm was brewing. In 1903, Annie woke up to shocking news. Across America, Newspapers were publishing a scandalous story. Annie Oakley arrested for stealing to buy cocaine. It was a complete lie. The story claimed she had been caught stealing a man's trousers to sell for drug money. But Annie had never even been near the city where it supposedly happened. The truth was cruelly simple. A woman who looked like her had been arrested, and a careless reporter had written the story using Annie Oakley's name to attract attention. Soon, dozens of newspapers copied it without checking the facts. Her reputation, built over years of hard work and honesty, was suddenly under attack. People who had admired her began to question her. For someone who had lived her whole life with integrity, this was unbearable. But Annie Oakley was not the kind of woman to stay silent. She decided to fight back, not with bullets, but with the truth. Annie began suing every newspaper that had printed the false story. One by one, she took them to court. She didn't care about the money. She cared about her name. It took 6 long years, but she won 55 out of 55 lawsuits. Her determination amazed everyone. In an era when few women ever challenged powerful men, Annie stood alone, fearless and steady. Just as she did on the shooting line, reporters began calling her the woman who never misses, in court or in the field. Through it all, her husband Frank stood by her side just as he always had. Their marriage remained strong, built on respect, loyalty, and love. By the time she cleared her name, Annie was in her 40s. She could have retired quietly, but instead she chose to use her fame for good. She gave shooting lessons to women across the country and even trained young soldiers during wartime. She donated much of her money to orphanages and charities, helping young girls who had faced struggles like hers. No matter how famous she became, she never forgot where she came from. The cold Ohio woods, the hunger, the long nights of struggle. Annie often said that her success came not from luck, but from hard work and belief in herself. Aim at the high mark, she told her students. You'll hit it 9 times out of 10. In the early 1900s, as motion pictures and new forms of entertainment began to rise, Annie Oakley's time on the stage slowly came to an end. But her legend was already bigger than the show itself. To the people, she wasn't just a performer. She was proof that courage has no gender. She was the small-town girl who had defeated poverty, injury, lies, and prejudice, and had never once missed her mark. By the end of her career, Annie Oakley had become more than a Wild West sharpshooter. She was a symbol of American perseverance, a living reminder that grace, skill, and honesty can make even the smallest person a giant in history. Her nickname, Little Sure Shot, wasn't just about her aim. It was about her heart. She never missed a shot, because she never lost her purpose. In the grand story of Annie Oakley's life, few relationships stood out more than her friendship with one of America's greatest Native American leaders, Sitting Bull. Their meeting was unexpected, their bond unlikely, but it became one of the most powerful and touching friendships in Wild West history. It all began in 1885, when Annie joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The show was already famous across America, combining adventure, history, and performance. It told the story of the American frontier, the battles, the legends, the spirit of freedom. Among its many stars was Sitting Bull, the legendary Lakota Sioux chief who had once fought to defend his people's land. He was known around the world as the man who helped lead the native forces to victory at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where General Custer was defeated. To many Americans, he was a fierce warrior, a symbol of resistance. But to those who knew him personally, he was wise, calm, and deeply spiritual. When Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's show, he was already older, his face lined with years of experience and struggle. He had agreed to tour not for fame or money, but to tell his people's story, to show the world that Native Americans were not savages, but human beings with courage, honor, and pride. Annie and Sitting Bull first met behind the stage before a performance in St. Paul, Minnesota. She had heard about him, of course. Everyone had. But she never imagined that he would be so gentle and respectful. As she approached, he watched her carefully. Then, after a moment of silence, he smiled. He called her Watanya Cecilia, meaning Little Sure Shot. It was the name he would give her forever. He said, "The Great Spirit has given you a steady hand and a brave heart. You are my adopted daughter now." Annie was touched beyond words. In that simple gesture, Sitting Bull gave her something greater than applause or fame, his respect. From that day on, they shared a deep friendship. Whenever the Wild West show traveled, Sitting Bull often sat quietly near the stage, watching Annie perform. He admired her discipline, her humility, and her courage, qualities he believed every warrior should have. Despite coming from two very different worlds, they understood each other perfectly. Both had faced loss, hardship, and misunderstanding. Both had been forced to prove themselves in a world that didn't always believe in them. Sitting Bull often said that Annie reminded him of his own daughters, brave, strong, and compassionate. He even gave her a pair of beaded moccasins and a small pair of moccasin dolls as gifts, symbols of friendship and honor. In return, Annie called him Papa, treating him like a second father. Their friendship became famous. Newspapers often mentioned how the great Sioux chief adored the young woman from Ohio. To the press, it seemed like an odd pair, the fierce warrior and the quiet sharpshooter. But to Annie and Sitting Bull, it was something simple, two souls who respected each other deeply. Sometimes, during their tours, they would sit together outside the camp at night, talking softly under the stars. Sitting Bull shared stories of his people, their traditions, their songs, and their struggles. He told Annie how the buffalo once covered the plains like an ocean, and how his heart ached to see them gone. Annie listened carefully. She had always admired nature and understood his sadness. She believed, like him, that the old ways of living close to the land were vanishing too quickly. For her, Sitting Bull was not just a performer or historical figure. He was a reminder of the real West, the one that existed before fame and spectacle. In the public shows, the crowd would cheer as Annie performed her shooting tricks, hitting tiny targets while riding horseback or splitting a playing card with one shot. After every perfect performance, Sitting Bull would proudly raise his hand and shout, "Little Sure Shot! My daughter has made the Great Spirit smile." The audience loved their friendship. It wasn't staged. It was real. Annie often said that the way Sitting Bull treated her gave her even more confidence to perform. His faith in her made her believe even more in herself. But beyond friendship, there was a deeper meaning to their connection. At a time when Native Americans were often treated unfairly, Annie's friendship with Sitting Bull showed compassion and equality. She didn't see him as a defeated enemy or a performer. She saw him as a hero and a friend. This bond also changed how many audiences saw Sitting Bull. They no longer viewed him as a villain from old stories. They saw him as a wise, kind leader, a man of dignity and peace. In that way, Annie and Sitting Bull together helped bridge two worlds, the native and the settler, the past and the future. Their friendship lasted until the end of Sitting Bull's life. When he left the Wild West show to return to his people, he and Annie said goodbye with tears. He told her, "Remember, my daughter, wherever you go, the Great Spirit walks with you." Annie kept his words close to her heart. When news came years later that Sitting Bull had been killed in 1890 during an arrest, Annie was heartbroken. She cried quietly, saying, "He was one of the truest friends I ever had." From that day on, she always carried the name he gave her, Little Sure Shot, with pride. To her, it wasn't just a title. It was a blessing. It reminded her of the respect between two people who came from different worlds, but shared the same values: courage, honesty, and kindness. The story of Annie Oakley and Sitting Bull remains one of the most remarkable friendships in American history. It showed that even in an age of division and struggle, understanding and respect could still exist between two hearts that saw the world through the same truth. That honor matters more than fame, and friendship lasts longer than legends. By the early 1900s, Annie Oakley was no longer just a performer. She was a national treasure. Her name stood for skill, courage, and dignity. She had performed for presidents and queens, amazed crowds across continents, and won the hearts of millions. But behind the applause and shining lights, Annie was about to face one of the darkest chapters of her life, a test not of her aim, but of her character. After leaving Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, Annie continued performing across America with her husband, Frank Butler. They traveled from city to city, giving shooting exhibitions that were more graceful than violent, more art than show. Annie could still draw a crowd wherever she went, but her fame also made her a target. In the early 1900s, newspapers were the most powerful voices in the country. They could build reputations or destroy them, with a single headline. And in 1903, one headline would nearly ruin everything Annie had worked for. One morning, while traveling between shows, Annie picked up a newspaper and froze. The front page screamed, "Famous sharpshooter Annie Oakley arrested for theft, stole to buy cocaine." The article claimed that she had been caught stealing a man's trousers to sell for drug money. It said she had fallen into addiction and disgrace. Annie's hands trembled as she read the words. It couldn't be real. She had never even been to the city mentioned in the article. She had never touched drugs in her life. At first, she thought it was some cruel mistake, a printing error that would be corrected the next day. But by morning, the story had spread. Dozens of newspapers across the country copied it without checking the facts. Each paper twisted the story further, adding their own lies. Some even printed fake quotes. In just days, Annie Oakley's name, once a symbol of honor, was splashed across the country as a scandal. The truth was simple and heartbreaking. A woman who looked like Annie had been arrested, and a careless reporter had assumed it was her. That single mistake turned into a storm of lies. Annie's reputation, the pride she had earned over years of hard work, was suddenly at risk. People whispered. Some refused to hire her for shows. For a woman who valued honesty above all else, this was unbearable. Frank Butler tried to calm her, but Annie could not let it go. She said quietly, "I can't shoot my way through this one. Frank, I'll have to fight it another way." And fight she did. In one of the boldest acts of her life, Annie Oakley took on the entire American press. She decided to sue every single newspaper that had printed the false story. Most people thought she was crazy. In that era, few women ever challenged powerful editors or businessmen, especially someone as respected as William Randolph Hearst, whose newspapers had been among the first to print the lie. But Annie wasn't afraid. She had faced hunger, storms, and train crashes. She had faced ridicule as a woman with a gun in a man's world. Now she would face the media, and she would not miss. For 6 long years, Annie Oakley went from courtroom to courtroom across America. She paid her own travel expenses, gathered evidence, and faced rooms full of men who doubted her. But she never wavered. In every city she stood tall, calm, and polite, just like she had on the shooting range. She told her story, presented her proof, and demanded justice, and one by one she won. In total, Annie filed 55 lawsuits and won 54 of them. Some newspapers paid her small settlements. Others issued public apologies. But Annie didn't care about money. She cared about her name, her truth, and her legacy. Her victory made headlines again. But this time, the world was on her side. The same newspapers that had tried to destroy her were now forced to print stories about her courage. People began calling her the woman who never missed, in the field or in court. Annie's fight showed the nation something rare: integrity. She didn't just defend herself. She defended the idea that truth mattered, even when the world seemed to reward lies. After the lawsuits, Annie returned to her peaceful life with Frank. She performed occasionally, but now her focus was different. She began teaching young women how to shoot, not for sport, but for self-protection and confidence. She believed that every woman should have the courage to stand up for herself, just as she had. "A woman must know how to protect her home," she often said. "The world will respect her more when she can aim steady." Her teachings inspired a new generation of women to see strength as something beautiful, not something to be ashamed of. Through all of this, Annie's love for Frank never faded. He remained her greatest supporter, traveling with her everywhere. Their bond, built on trust, laughter, and respect, survived fame, injury, and scandal. They often said they were happiest not on stage, but together on quiet evenings, sharing coffee and stories about the road. By the end of her long battle with the press, Annie Oakley's reputation was stronger than ever. She had proven that the truth can win, if you stand your ground and never give up. Her aim had always been perfect, but her greatest shot wasn't fired from a gun. It was fired from her courage. She had faced the most powerful voices in the country, and she had beaten them all. From that day on, Annie Oakley became more than a legend of the Wild West. She became a symbol of integrity, a woman who refused to let the world define her. Her story reminded everyone that even in a storm of lies, one clear voice of truth can still be heard, if it never misses its mark. By the time the new century began, Annie Oakley had already lived the kind of life most people only read about. She had gone from a poor Ohio farm girl to a world-famous legend, loved by millions, admired by royalty, and respected by soldiers and sharpshooters alike. But even the greatest marksmen can't aim their way around fate. And one day fate struck Annie Oakley hard. In the summer of 1901, Annie and her husband, Frank Butler, were traveling with a new show, the Vernon Seavers Young Buffalo Wild West Show. It was another exciting tour, filled with gunfire tricks, cowboy acts, and cheering crowds. The schedule was demanding. They performed nearly every day, moving from one town to another by train. Then, one dark morning near Wilmington, North Carolina, disaster hit. Their train collided with another. The impact was violent. Cars twisted, glass shattered, and steam filled the air. Screams echoed through the wreckage as people tried to escape. Annie was thrown from her seat and badly injured. Her spine and legs took the worst of it. When rescuers found her, she was barely conscious. Doctors feared she might never walk again, let alone perform. For Annie, it was the cruelest twist imaginable. Shooting wasn't just her career, it was her identity, her life story. Now, lying in bed, she faced a challenge she couldn't fight with a gun. At first, she struggled with despair. She had spent her whole life moving, performing, and inspiring others. Now she couldn't even stand. But the same strength that had guided her through childhood hunger, loss, and lies refused to let her surrender. She told Frank quietly, "I will stand again, and I will shoot again." The road to recovery was long and painful. Annie endured months of therapy and rest, teaching herself to walk step by step. She trained her hands to stay steady, her focus to stay sharp. Each day was another test of endurance, another lesson in patience. Frank stayed by her side the entire time, reading to her, cooking for her, and reminding her of who she was. He never doubted her. One evening, after months of struggle, Annie asked Frank to bring her rifle. She sat up in bed, aimed at a small candle across the room, and fired. The flame flickered out. A perfect shot. Tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "I'm back." When Annie finally returned to performing, the crowds went wild. People who thought they'd never see her again stood in packed theaters just to watch her shoot. She was older now, but her aim hadn't changed. If anything, her precision seemed sharper, every bullet landing exactly where she wanted. Reporters called her return the great comeback of Little Sure Shot. Her first few shows were emotional. When she stepped on stage for the first time after the accident, the audience stood and clapped before she even touched her gun. Many had tears in their eyes. They knew what she had overcome. Annie bowed, smiled, and began her act. Each target shattered as cleanly as ever. It wasn't just a performance, it was a victory. After her recovery, Annie continued performing for several years. But she also began focusing on something new, teaching. She believed that her skills could help others, especially women, gain confidence and independence. She started offering shooting lessons to women across the country, often free of charge. Her belief was simple. A woman who can handle a gun can handle her life. At a time when women couldn't even vote, Annie taught them courage, one lesson, one bullet at a time. During World War I, Annie offered to train soldiers for combat. She even volunteered to teach marksmanship to the Army, free of cost. Though her offer wasn't officially accepted, she did visit many military camps, inspiring young recruits with her skill and determination. Even in her 50s and 60s, Annie could still hit a target others could barely see. Her eyesight remained sharp, her composure unshaken, but as she aged, time began to take its toll. Years of traveling, performing, and hardship left her body weaker. She retired quietly with Frank in a small cottage near Greenville, Ohio, not far from where she had been born. The life she now led was peaceful, far from the noise and chaos of the shows. She enjoyed long walks, writing letters, and visiting friends. But even in retirement, she continued to receive fan mail from around the world. Children wrote to her saying she was their hero. Young women said she had inspired them to be brave and independent. Even soldiers sent her letters, thanking her for teaching them to aim high, both in shooting and in life. Annie Oakley's final public performance came in 1922. She was 62 years old. Her hair had turned gray, but her eyes still sparkled with the same determination she had as a girl in the Ohio woods. When she stepped up to fire her rifle one last time, the crowd fell silent. She lifted her gun, aimed, and fired, hitting every target perfectly. It was the end of an era, the final performance of the woman who had outshot every man, outlived every rumor, and outlasted every storm. After that, Annie quietly retired for good. She and Frank lived simply, content with each other's company and the memories they had made. They had shared the stage, the road, and a lifetime of love. Annie once said, "I have never once regretted the life I chose, only that it could not last forever." She had faced hunger, injury, lies, and fame, and triumphed over them all. Her story wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about resilience, the kind of strength that never fades, even when the spotlight does. And though she no longer performed, the name Annie Oakley continued to echo through America, a symbol of courage, confidence, and unbreakable spirit. As the roaring crowds faded and the gunfire of the Wild West shows grew silent, Annie Oakley entered a quieter chapter of her life. She had spent decades traveling the world, performing before kings and queens, inspiring soldiers and children, and proving that courage and grace could live in the same heart. Now, in her final years, she wanted only peace, love, and home. Annie and her husband Frank Butler settled in a small cottage in Greenville, Ohio, not far from the place where she was born. The cabin was modest, surrounded by open fields and whispering trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in their lives, they weren't traveling, rehearsing, or performing. They were simply living. Frank took care of the garden. Annie cooked, sewed, and wrote letters to old friends from the Wild West days. They often sat together on the porch at sunset, watching the fields turn gold, remembering their adventures, the long tours, the endless train rides, the laughter of the crowd, and the smell of gunpowder in the air. Annie's days were calm, but never idle. Even in retirement, she continued to teach marksmanship to women and children in the community. She believed that shooting was not just about hitting a target. It was about focus, self-respect, and courage. She once told a student, "When you learn to aim true, you learn to live true." To her, it was never about fame or money anymore. It was about giving back, passing on the lessons that had shaped her from the cold woods of Ohio to the grandest stages in the world. The world around Annie had changed dramatically. The Wild West she once represented was now gone, replaced by automobiles, airplanes, and city lights. But Annie's name still carried power. People still recognized her on the street, tipping their hats with admiration. Newspapers often visited her home for interviews. When reporters asked her what she missed most about her days in the Wild West, she smiled softly and said, "The people." The laughter, the feeling that every show was someone's first dream of freedom. She didn't miss the fame, she missed the wonder. In 1922, after years of peace, Annie and Frank suffered another car accident. It left her with serious injuries to her hip and legs. For a time, it seemed she might never walk again. But just as she had after the train crash 20 years earlier, Annie refused to give up. Through pain and perseverance, she regained her strength. She was slower now, but her spirit was unbroken. Her aim, incredibly, remained perfect. Even in her 60s, she could still hit targets at distances most shooters wouldn't dare attempt. When she gave exhibitions for friends or local events, she always hit her mark, every time. As she grew older, Annie began to reflect on her life more deeply. She often spoke about how grateful she was for her journey, the struggles, the victories, and the people who had walked beside her. She never forgot her humble beginnings, the hunger, the cold winters, or the days she hunted to keep her family alive. "Those days taught me everything," she said once. "They taught me that every shot counts, not just with a gun, but in life." Annie and Frank's love remained as strong as ever. They had been together for over 50 years, through fame and hardship, triumph and tragedy. They never had children of their own, but to them, the world had been their family, the audiences, the soldiers, the women she taught, and the countless people who loved them. They called each other partner, just as they had since the very beginning. In the mornings, Frank would brew coffee while Annie read the newspaper aloud. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, sometimes laughing about old shows or remembering their time with Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull. Their love was quiet, constant and unshakable, the kind of love built not on words, but on years of standing side by side. In 1926, Annie's health began to decline. Years of traveling, injuries, and exhaustion had finally caught up to her. Even then, she faced it with dignity. She continued to write letters, to smile, and to tell stories to anyone who visited. When people asked if she regretted anything, she would shake her head gently. "No," she said. "I've lived my life exactly as I wished, and I would do it all again." On November 3, 1926, Annie Oakley passed away peacefully in her sleep in Greenville, Ohio. She was 66 years old. Just 18 days later, her beloved Frank Butler followed her in death. Those who knew them said it seemed as if his heart couldn't bear to live without her. Even in death, they remained side by side, partners to the very end. When the news of Annie's passing spread, tributes poured in from across the country. Newspapers called her the true American legend, the woman who never missed, and the spirit of the frontier. Soldiers, performers, and ordinary people all mourned her loss. Buffalo Bill Cody, her old friend and mentor, had once said, "Annie Oakley is the perfect symbol of what America could be, brave, honest, and free." Even years after her death, those words still rang true. Today, Annie Oakley's name still echoes through history. Her rifles rest in museums, her photographs hang in halls of fame, and her story continues to inspire people around the world. She broke barriers, challenged traditions, and proved that a woman's courage could stand equal to any man's. Her life wasn't just about bullets and targets. It was about believing in yourself when no one else does. It was about aiming high, standing tall, and never missing your mark. And though her final shot has long faded, the echo of her courage still rings through time. The guns of the Wild West have long fallen silent. The dusty arenas, the roaring crowds, and the banners of Buffalo Bill's great show are gone, faded into history. But one name still echoes across time: Annie Oakley. Her story did not end with her death. In many ways, it only truly began there. Annie Oakley was more than a sharpshooter. She was a symbol, a living reminder that courage, precision, and grace could live together in one person. Her life told a simple truth: you don't need to be loud to be powerful, and you don't need to be born lucky to become great. From the day she picked up her father's old rifle in the frozen woods of Ohio, Annie aimed not just at targets, but at possibility itself. She proved that a young girl from nothing could stand on the world's biggest stage and leave kings and queens speechless. She turned survival into skill and skill into history. After her passing in 1926, the world refused to forget her. Songs were written in her honor, stories told around campfires and classrooms. Newspapers printed her image beside the word legend. Children grew up playing pretend as Annie Oakley, aiming imaginary rifles, shouting her name like a badge of bravery. In 1946, her life became the inspiration for one of Broadway's most famous musicals, Annie, Get Your Gun. It told the story of the girl who could do anything you can do, better. The show became a worldwide hit, introducing her legend to a new generation who had never seen the Wild West but still dreamed of its freedom. Later came movies, books, and documentaries, each one telling her story in new ways. But no matter how the story was retold, one thing always remained true: Annie Oakley was real, her courage was real, and her message was timeless. Annie's name still appears in unexpected places, in museums, songs, and even in everyday language. The phrase Annie Oakley became slang for a free pass or a complimentary ticket, because during her shows, she often signed free tickets for friends and admirers. Even in slang, her generosity lived on, but her legacy runs deeper than entertainment. Annie Oakley opened doors that had been locked for generations. In a time when women were told they belonged only in the home, she stood in front of thousands, rifle in hand, and showed the world what women could do. She didn't shout about women's rights or demand attention. She simply proved it through her actions. Every perfect shot she fired was a statement of equality. Every show she performed was a message to young girls watching from the stands: you can be anything you want to be. Even today, historians and fans still find inspiration in her life. She taught discipline, respect, and self-control, qualities that go far beyond shooting. Modern athletes, performers, and pioneers often mention her name when they speak of resilience and focus. In 1960, she was inducted into the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame, honoring her as one of the greatest women of the American frontier. Later, her rifles, costumes, and photographs became treasured museum pieces, reminders of the small woman with the unshakable aim and unbreakable will. Every time someone sees her old portrait, the calm eyes, the confident pose, the faint smile, they can almost feel her presence. It's as if she's still watching the target, steadying her breath, ready to fire one last perfect shot. Annie Oakley's story isn't just American history, it's human history. It's about perseverance, humility, and the quiet power of belief. She rose from hunger and loss, faced ridicule, injury, and lies, and conquered them all. She lived in a world that doubted women, mocked dreamers, and rewarded the loud. And still, she stood firm, proving that dignity and talent can speak louder than any gunshot. If there is one lesson her life leaves behind, it is this: your background does not decide your destiny. Annie Oakley came from nothing, no wealth, no connections, no fancy education. Just a steady hand, a strong heart, and an unshakable belief that she could aim higher. And because she did, millions after her learned to do the same. When visitors travel to Greenville, Ohio, they can still find her resting place beside Frank Butler, her lifelong partner, the man who believed in her from the start. Their graves lie side by side, marked simply with their names and dates. No grand statue, no monument of gold, just two souls who lived, loved, and changed history together. People often leave small trinkets at her grave: flowers, coins, even spent bullets. Tokens of gratitude for a woman who proved that greatness is not measured in power, but in purpose. Annie once said, "Aim at a high mark, and you'll hit it 9 times out of 10. Aim at nothing, and you'll hit it every time." Those words became her lasting message, a truth for every generation. Her rifle may be silent now, but her spirit never stopped echoing through time. From the quiet forests of Ohio to the bright lights of Broadway, from the dusty arenas of the Wild West to the hearts of dreamers everywhere, her name continues to remind us to aim high, stay steady, and never lose sight of the target. Because legends like Annie Oakley don't fade. They live forever in the stories we tell, the courage we find, and the dreams we dare to chase.